Two girls lost their mother. When they thought they could speak to her again, this unthinkable horror happened. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen's life was turned upside down when his wife passed away suddenly from cancer. His daughters, Tina, 15, and Karen, 9, were devastated by the loss of their mother, and the grief was compounded by the fact that her income had been crucial to the family's stability. Frank, desperate to keep things financially afloat, began working long hours, often late into the night, leaving the girls to deal with their sorrow alone. One evening, while their father was working, the girls, still reeling from the loss, found themselves alone in the house. They missed their mother deeply and, in their sadness, began to wonder if there was a way to communicate with her again. It was then that they remembered an old Ouija board they had, something they had never really taken seriously before. Desperate for a sign, they decided to give it a try. They set up the board in the basement, each placing a finger lightly on the planchette. They nervously asked, "Mom, are you here with us?" But the planchette remained still. They asked again and again, hoping for a response. But after over an hour of waiting, the board gave them nothing. Frustrated and heartbroken, they abandoned the seance and headed back upstairs to their rooms. As they lay in their beds, still struggling with their grief, they heard something, a faint tapping sound coming from below them. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the usual nighttime creaks of an old house. But as the tapping continued, its rhythm became more deliberate, almost as if it was trying to grab their attention. The sound wasn't consistent, but it was persistent enough to make them uneasy. The girls couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to communicate with them, just as they had hoped the Ouija board would. At first, the girls tried to ignore the faint tapping, but as it continued, they couldn't help but listen more closely. The sound was eerie, and Karen, the younger sister, began to feel increasingly nervous. Unable to ignore it any longer, she went to Tina's room. "Do you hear that tapping?" Karen asked, her voice trembling with fear. Tina nodded, still confused. "Yeah, what is it?" Together they stepped into the hallway, following the tapping, which seemed to be coming from downstairs. They slowly approached the top of the stairs, but from their vantage point, they couldn't see much, only the halfway landing. The tapping was clearly coming from below. After a moment of silence, one of the girls whispered, "What if the tapping is Mom? What if the seance worked and she's here with us?" The idea sparked a glimmer of hope. Excited but apprehensive, one of them called out, "Mom, is that you down there?" Immediately, a distinct tap, tap, tap came from downstairs. The girls froze, hearts pounding. The tapping seemed to answer their question. They exchanged wide-eyed looks, both stunned by the possibility that their mother was trying to communicate. Excited, they asked for another sign. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign," one of them said. Once again, the tapping responded. With their belief growing stronger, the girls cautiously descended the stairs, following the tapping sound. It led them to the basement door. They opened it slowly, and the tapping continued from below, almost as if it was guiding them. But even though they were convinced it was their mom, the dark basement made them hesitate. They stayed at the top of the stairs, asking more questions, eagerly awaiting more answers from below. Each tap reassured them that their mother was still there, still reaching out. As the minutes passed, 30, 45, maybe even longer, the tapping slowly faded. The girls continued asking questions, but the responses grew quieter until, eventually, it stopped entirely. Buzzing with excitement, they were convinced they'd spoken to their mother. They couldn't wait to tell their father when he came home. Instead of sleeping, they stayed up in the kitchen, filled with anticipation. When Frank finally returned, well past midnight, he found his daughters awake, eyes wide from the experience. They eagerly rushed to him, bursting to share what had happened. "Dad, "You wouldn't believe it," they exclaimed. "We did a seance, and we heard tapping. Mom was with us. We were talking to her." Frank, surprised by their excitement, listened as they described everything. Although he couldn't fully understand what they were feeling, he could see how much the experience meant to them. They seemed happy for the first time in a while, and he felt a sense of relief that they were finding comfort. Despite not fully grasping the cause of the tapping, Frank didn't question their belief. He could tell it was helping them cope with their grief, so instead of challenging it, he smiled and reassured them. "Of course your mom is here. She'll always be here, looking out for you." The girls, feeling validated, went to bed with hearts full of hope, convinced that their mother was still with them. Frank, though not fully convinced, dismissed the tapping as a coping mechanism for his grieving daughters. He didn't believe it was his wife reaching out, but if it made them feel better, he wasn't about to challenge it. Over the next few days, the tapping continued. It wasn't just in the basement anymore. It seemed to come from all over the house. No matter where it was, the girls were the only ones who could hear it. They eagerly called Frank over, but he never heard a thing. He smiled and reassured them that their mother was still with them in spirit, convinced it was harmless. But over time, the girls' feelings began to shift. What had once felt like a comforting sign of their mother's presence now started to feel unsettling. The tapping was no longer just a comforting reminder. It was constant and inexplicable, coming at all hours from places they couldn't identify. What had once brought them solace now felt like an uninvited presence. The excitement began to fade, replaced by growing unease. By the third day after the seance, the tapping was focused more and more on their bedrooms. At night, the sounds came from under their beds, inside their closets, places where no one could be. Terrified, they called Frank, but each time, he found nothing. He reassured them, chalking it up to old house noises, but the fear in their voices made him worry. Frank had hoped this was just a phase, but now it was clear it was affecting their sleep, and the fear was palpable. Something had to change. He sat the girls down, trying to reason with them. "These tapping sounds are just house noises, girls. You're overthinking it. Your mom is here, but she's not making those sounds. You need to let this go." But Tina and Karen were adamant. "Dad, we know what we're hearing," they said, trembling. "We think the seance worked, but it wasn't Mom. We think we unlocked something else, something evil." Hearing this, Frank's stomach turned. He'd hoped it would stop, but now his daughters were convinced they'd summoned something dark. The tapping was no longer just a noise. It was a sign of something dangerous. Frank couldn't help but wonder, what had they actually unleashed with that Ouija board? And was it too late to make it stop? The tapping, once a source of comfort, had grown increasingly sinister, and Frank knew he needed to do something to protect his daughters. But he couldn't understand their fear. He tried reasoning with them, insisting the sounds were just normal house noises, or things they were imagining. "It's all in your heads," he'd say. "Just creaky floors." Yet Tina and Karen remained convinced. The more Frank dismissed it, the more their fear intensified, and the tension in the house grew. As days passed, the girls avoided being at home, especially at night when the tapping was most frequent. They found excuses to stay out, often at friends' houses, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere. Frank, at a loss, suggested seeing a grief counselor, but he could see it wasn't just a phase. The tapping wasn't stopping, and it was disrupting their lives. One night, about a week after the seance, Tina and Karen found themselves alone at home. With Frank working late, the tapping started again, this time from the basement. The girls had grown used to the noise, but it was still unsettling. They now believed it was an evil spirit, and the mystery of the source became too much to ignore. Tina, determined, turned to Karen. "We have to go down there and find out what's making these sounds. If we don't, no one will." Though terrified, Karen couldn't stay upstairs alone, so she reluctantly agreed. Tina grabbed a knife from the kitchen, more for protection than necessity, and together they descended the narrow basement stairs. The space was cold and damp, filled with forgotten boxes, but it was eerily quiet, until the tapping began again. They both felt a mix of dread and anticipation, knowing they had to face whatever had been haunting them. In the beginning, they'd convinced themselves the tapping was their mother's spirit, but now it had grown darker. They couldn't ignore it anymore. At the bottom of the stairs, they froze. Scrawled in red on the wall were the words, "I'm in your closet. Come find me." The tapping they'd heard for days had now escalated into something far more terrifying. Panic set in as Tina, still clutching the knife, grabbed Karen's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. They rushed up in a frantic scramble, hearts pounding, only to freeze in terror when they reached the top. The nightmare was far from over. The red words on the basement wall sent a jolt of terror through Tina and Karen. They didn't need to speak. They both understood the gravity of what they had found. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. Without hesitation, they fled the basement, running straight to the neighbor's house, not even bothering to close the door behind them. Their fear was palpable as they knocked frantically, desperate for safety. The neighbor, startled by their frantic appearance, ushered them inside. The girls, barely able to control their trembling voices, explained what had happened. "We did a seance, and now there's tapping and writing on the wall. We don't know what's going on." Tina gasped, her words tumbling out. The neighbor, concerned but confused, led them to sit down, reassuring them that they were safe while they waited for Frank. As they sat in the neighbor's living room, the fear didn't subside. They couldn't stop thinking about the words on the wall, the tapping that had now taken on a darker tone. They hoped Frank would have the answers, but what if he didn't? When Frank arrived, the neighbor quickly relayed the story. Frank, still skeptical, insisted that the sounds and writings were all part of the girls' grieving process. He reassured them to stay put and went to check the house. Inside the Bowen home, Frank checked every room, convinced it was just an overreaction. But when he found the same message scrawled in ketchup on the stairwell wall, his unease grew. The words, "I'm in your closet. Come find me," sent a chill down his spine. But he still couldn't believe anything supernatural was at play. After searching and finding nothing else, Frank returned to the neighbor's house. He firmly explained to the girls that they had written the message, attributing it all to their grief. "This is just in your heads. I should have seen it sooner," he said, genuinely concerned. The girls, knowing they hadn't written the words, felt a deep sense of dread, but they didn't argue. They were exhausted and reluctantly agreed to counseling. "Fine, we'll go," Tina said, her voice low, and Karen nodded in agreement. The next day, they went to grief counseling, and the strange happenings seemed to cease. The tapping stopped, and the house returned to quiet. Frank believed the ordeal was behind them. But in the silence, the girls couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. They were left wondering if they had imagined it all, or if something truly dark had been in their home. The atmosphere in the Bowen household was thick with fear as Frank walked into a scene that made no sense. Lights were on, the TV and radio blared, and furniture was out of place. Initially, he wondered if the girls had staged it, but they had been with him all evening. Confused and unsettled, Frank stepped inside, his mind racing. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Tina, Karen, and their friend Kathleen followed, anxiety palpable. The house, which had been eerily quiet for weeks, now felt like a source of dread again. Frank moved through the first floor, turning off the TV and radio and fixing the furniture. But no matter where he searched, second floor, attic, basement, no one was there. It didn't make sense. Then, Frank noticed something he'd missed in his initial sweep, a small sitting room. As he entered, his eyes landed on the wall. Written in shaving cream were the words, "Marry me." His stomach dropped. The girls couldn't have done this. They were too terrified. Before he could process it further, a rustling came from the closet in the corner of the room. The door creaked open, and from the shadows emerged a man, wearing his late wife's dress. The same dress she had worn only days before her passing. But this was no man Frank recognized. His face was covered in thick clown makeup, and he held a hatchet. Frozen in terror, Frank could only stare as the figure looked at him, then at the girls behind him. It spoke in a voice that was both calm and unnervingly harsh. You and the girls, go upstairs." Panic surged through Frank. Protecting his daughters was his first instinct. He stepped in front of them. "Go upstairs," he shouted, urging them urgently. Tina, Karen, and Kathleen didn't hesitate, fear driving them up the stairs without a glance back. Frank's heart raced as he stayed behind, blocking the man's path. The figure didn't move, only staring at him with a twisted, almost amused expression. Frank's mind was screaming. This wasn't a delusion. This was real. Something evil was in his house. With the girls safe upstairs, Frank had no choice but to confront the figure. The man in the dress stepped closer, raising the hatchet slightly, his grin widening. Frank tried to steady his breath, asking shakily, "Who are you?" But the man only took a slow step forward, his grin growing more twisted. The tension in the room was suffocating. Frank knew that whatever this was, it was no longer just an illusion. It was a nightmare come to life. As the girls fled, Frank faced the man. The figure took a step toward him, holding the hatchet and grinning with wild eyes. Frank's heart pounded. This was no delusion. Something evil was in his home. But before Frank could act, Tina's frantic scream echoed from upstairs. "Dad, get up here! Something's in the closet!" Time seemed to freeze. Frank turned toward the stairs, but as he did, he saw the figure in the dress, now closer than ever, eyes glinting with malice. This was no longer just an unsettling night. Something far darker had returned to the house. The police, baffled by the strange events, continued their investigation, but their efforts hit dead ends. Frank's description of the intruder, clown makeup, a dress, and a hatchet, was too bizarre to follow. With no leads, the authorities were left with nothing but confusion. For days, the Bowen family stayed with a friend, trying to make sense of the terrifying events. The fear of the intruder haunted them, especially Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, who couldn't shake the image of the man with the hatchet. Police surveillance continued, but nothing unusual happened. For 2 days, the house remained still, locked up tight, with no signs of the intruder. The rumors in town swirled, but no one had seen anyone matching the description of the man. Then, on the 3rd day, an officer noticed something odd. The sliding glass door at the Bowen house was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but just enough to raise suspicion. The officer called for backup, and soon the area was swarming with police. They breached the house, expecting to find the intruder, or at least signs of a return. But again, the house was empty. It was as if no one had been there at all. Everything was untouched, except for one thing. By the sliding glass door, they found a hatchet. It lay on the ground just outside the door, as if dropped hastily. No sign of the intruder anywhere. The police were left with no answers. The house was under surveillance, but there was no way to know where the man had gone. They concluded that whoever had been there was gone, for now. Still, they assured Frank that they would keep watching the house. Despite the reassurances, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. His once safe home had been turned upside down by an unknown intruder, and the fear lingered. Days passed in confusion and dread. The family tried to stay away from the house, but as the surveillance continued, they hoped the worst had passed. However, on the night of December 11th, something changed. At around 2:30 a.m., the police surveillance team reported that someone had been spotted entering the Bowen property again. The officers arrived at the Bowen house, only to be met with an eerie silence. The lights were off, the house seemingly untouched. But then they noticed it. The back window was open, and the unmistakable sound of tapping echoed through the house. It had started again. This time, there were no signs of an intruder. No hatchet, no strange figure, just the tapping. Frank's heart raced as he stepped inside, trying to push past the unsettling feeling that gripped him. The house was still. Too still. The events of the past few days felt as though they were slowly slipping away, but Frank couldn't shake the dread in his gut. As he moved through the quiet house, nothing seemed out of place. No overturned furniture, no mess. It felt as if nothing had happened at all. Yet, there was a palpable tension in the air. Frank quickly grabbed a few personal items, feeling a growing need to leave, but something stopped him as he approached the back door. It was slightly ajar again, just like the night the intruder had vanished. Then he heard it. The tapping. Faint at first, then louder, more distinct. It was coming from the walls. A cold chill ran down Frank's spine. This wasn't just his mind playing tricks. He wasn't imagining it. The tapping was real. Without thinking, Frank ran up the stairs, his heart pounding. He reached the hallway, and that's when he saw it. Fresh scratches on the walls. Deep, deliberate marks. Fingerprints smeared in something dark and sticky. His stomach churned as he realized someone, or something, had been here, clawing its way up the walls. And then, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from one of the girls' rooms, Tina's room. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he moved toward the door, his mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. Frank, paralyzed with dread, cautiously approached Tina's room. The tapping grew louder as he reached the door, which swung open on its own. Inside, the air felt wrong. Heavy, cold, unnatural. The room, once untouched, was now a mess. Furniture turned, books scattered, and the closet door wide open. The tapping came from within the closet, frantic, as though something, or someone, was trying to escape. Frank's heart raced as he reached for the door, trembling. But when he opened it, the closet was empty. Then he noticed something strange. A dark smear on the floor, as if something had been dragged across the carpet. Before he could process it, a low, guttural whisper echoed from the walls. "Frank." The tapping stopped. The house fell silent. Terrified, Frank slammed the door shut and fled downstairs, running out of the house and back to his family. Whatever haunted this place wasn't finished. Still shaken, Frank explained everything to the officer, insisting that he'd seen movement upstairs. But the officer remained skeptical, assuring Frank that the house was secure and there had been no signs of anyone entering. "Maybe your mind's playing tricks," the officer suggested, "but I'll go take a quick look around." Frank agreed, desperate for reassurance. He watched anxiously as the officer entered. Minutes passed. Then the officer reappeared, confusion on his face. "Sir," the officer called. "There's no one inside, but it's strange. The furniture's been moved, just like you said. And on the walls there's marks. It looks like someone's been here, but there's no sign of forced entry." Frank's stomach dropped. It was happening again. This time, it was worse. Whoever, or whatever, was haunting them had left its mark, and it was still inside the house. "Wait here. Let me go back in," the officer said, his voice tight with tension. Frank watched him disappear into the house, his mind racing. Was there new writing on the walls? Had it escalated beyond just the tapping? Minutes later, Frank heard the officer shout, "Frank, you need to get over here, now." His heart skipped a beat. Rushing inside, Frank saw the officer standing by the front room, pointing at the wall. Frank's blood ran cold as he read the words scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood. "I'm still here. Come find me." The writing was smeared and messy, like it had been written in a hurry. Frank's mind spun. "I didn't write that. I swear," he said, his voice shaking. The officer looked at him with disbelief. "If nobody's been in here? Then how could this happen?" Before Frank could respond, the tapping started again, distant at first, then growing louder, faster, as if something, or someone, was moving through the walls. The scraping sound followed, like nails on wood, reverberating through the house. Frank froze, his eyes drawn to a crack in the ceiling. Something was shifting inside it, as though trying to break through. The officer, now visibly shaken, reached for his gun. "I don't know what this is, but I'm not sticking around to find out," he said. But as they turned to leave, the front door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The house plunged into darkness. The tapping surrounded them, coming from every direction. Frank felt a cold certainty. Something was in this house that didn't belong. Something that was never going to let them go. Police swarmed the house, guns drawn, but despite their thorough search, there was no sign of an intruder. Every room, every corner was meticulously examined, but everything was eerily still. The unsettling details, mutilated family photos, the cryptic messages, suggested something malevolent was at play. Still, no one was found. Then, in the basement, a breakthrough came. One officer, frustrated and exhausted, leaned against the washing machine. The machine shifted, revealing a narrow tunnel in the wall. Flashlight in hand, the officer stepped closer, and from the darkness emerged a figure. Danny Lant, crouched and ragged, wearing a dress and holding a hatchet. His eyes gleamed with a disturbing calmness. The officers stared in disbelief as the twisted truth unraveled before them. Danny had been living in the walls of the Bowen home for months, spying on them, orchestrating the terror they had endured. The haunting noises, the blood-stained messages. It had all been Danny. Danny Lant, just 16 years old at the time, had been living in the walls of the Bowen household for months. 6 months prior to being discovered, Danny had had a brief encounter with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old daughter of the family. Tina barely remembered him, but Danny had developed a fixation on her. He believed that Tina had rejected him, though Tina didn't recall anything about the interaction. In response to his perceived rejection, Danny took extreme, disturbing measures. He broke into the Bowen home, cut a hole in the wall, and started living inside it. For 6 months, he remained hidden in the walls of their basement, watching the family as they went about their everyday lives, completely unaware of his presence. Though Danny was unable to access the entire house through the tunnels, he could navigate through the basement and into the first floor. To reach other parts of the house, he would leave the safety of the walls and move around the house while the family was home. No one ever noticed him. We hope you enjoyed this story as much as we did, even though it's shocking. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable stories.